The sun was merciless that afternoon, laying a hard glaze of heat over the fort's parade ground. Dust clung to the air like smoke after a battle, stirred up by restless boots and the shifting hooves of cavalry horses. The men of the regiment had gathered, their curiosity sharpened like knives, their laughter already riding the breeze. Something unusual was about to happen, and on the frontier, unusual meant entertainment. At the center of it all stood a woman. Her coat was plain, worn at the seams, her wide-brimmed hat shaded a face unbothered by the stares drilling into her from all sides. In her hands she held a long rifle, the kind that had seen storms and rivers, the kind that never sat idle for long. She wasn't dressed like the wives who followed the regiment, nor like the saloon girls who sometimes drifted close to camp. There was nothing soft in her stance. She stood tall, shoulders back, boots planted steady in the dust, and the rifle rested against her leg as if it belonged there, as much a part of her as her heartbeat. The crowd murmured, laughter punctuated the air, and then came the creak of leather as Colonel Hawthorne urged his horse forward. He was a broad man, his chest full of years and victories, with a mustache that bristled like a saber. He carried himself the way men do when they've survived too many gunfights to still believe in their own mortality. From the saddle he looked down at her, his lips curling into a grin that carried more arrogance than amusement. "This ain't your range, girl," he said, letting the words spill out slow and heavy, as though he was dropping stones into a well. His voice carried, echoing off the barracks and wagons, and the men burst into laughter at his taunt. But she didn't laugh, she didn't even blink. The colonel leaned forward, resting one elbow against the horn of his saddle. "You think you can outshoot my boys? That rifle'll kick you clear across the dirt. Best hand it over before you break yourself." His men roared again. A few elbowed each other, enjoying the show before it even started. The colonel was never above ridiculing anyone who wandered into camp thinking they had a skill worth testing against his regiment. Especially not a woman. Still, she remained silent, her expression unreadable. The only motion was her thumb brushing the smooth curve of her rifle's stock, like someone soothing a restless horse. The moment stretched. Dust swirled in lazy eddies, the air hot enough to sting the lungs. A younger soldier, barely out of boyhood, leaned forward as though he expected her to run. She didn't. Instead, she tilted the rifle in her hands, lowering it slightly so the sun flashed across the polished wood. For the first time, the crowd noticed something etched into it. Rows of marks. At first it seemed like scratches, the kind any weapon might pick up over years of travel. But no, the lines were too neat, too deliberate, carved with precision. Her gloved hand shifted again, and the light revealed more rows, stretching further than the eye wanted to believe. The laughter faltered. The colonel's grin didn't fade at once, but it no longer reached his eyes. He squinted, leaned forward, and stared at the rifle. His lips moved as he counted the cuts. 10, 20, 30, and still they ran on, like a ledger of death written into wood. The fort grew quiet except for the dry creak of leather and the far-off screech of a hawk circling high above. The colonel swallowed, his mustache twitching. He counted again, slower this time. By the time he reached the last line, his breath hitched. 121. The silence was thick now, hanging heavy over the crowd. The young soldiers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado crumbling. The woman lifted her head, her gaze cutting through the heat haze, steady and cold. "This rifle don't care whose range it is," she said at last, her voice low but carrying farther than a shout. "And neither do I." The silence wasn't just awkward, it was suffocating. The kind of silence that follows a gunshot, or the split second before a knife finds its target. Dust motes danced in the air, caught in shafts of sunlight slicing through the heat haze. Every man on the parade ground seemed to hold his breath. Even the horses, restless moments before, had gone still, ears flicking nervously as though they, too, understood what those carved marks meant. Colonel Hawthorne stayed in the saddle, though for the first time in years, he looked smaller up there. His authority, usually carved in stone, wavered under the weight of the notches gleaming on that rifle stock. He had seen tally marks before. Every soldier had, but never in numbers like this. 121. That wasn't the count of a hunter bagging deer in the mountains. That was the work of someone who had lived in battlefields the way others lived in towns. A soldier who fought without a uniform. A ghost in the wilderness who did not miss. The colonel's throat worked as he swallowed. His eyes narrowed, as if trying to convince himself he hadn't counted right. "Those marks," he began, voice lower now, the swagger gone, "who put 'em there?" The woman tilted the rifle ever so slightly, so the sun glanced off the metal of the barrel. "Me," she said simply. A ripple passed through the men, a mixture of disbelief and unease. The laughter that had echoed moments ago seemed like it belonged to another lifetime. The young soldier who had leaned forward earlier now stepped back, his boots scuffing in the dirt. One of the sergeants, older than most and hard around the edges, spat into the dust and muttered, "Lord Almighty," he had seen what one man with a steady hand could do. He had buried comrades because of it. His eyes stayed on her rifle like it was a rattlesnake coiled at his feet. Hawthorne tried to muster a grin again, but it cracked at the edges. 121, you expect us to believe that's, he caught himself, realizing the numbers weren't just etched randomly. Each one was carved with care, evenly spaced, like ritual. He recognized the truth the way soldiers recognize the smell of black powder before the smoke hits. What happened to the last man who laughed? The woman asked softly. The question wasn't playful. It wasn't even threatening. It was worse than that. It was a simple request for him to imagine, and judging by the way the colonel shifted in his saddle, he did. His mind filled with the image of a faceless soldier somewhere out on the plains, dropping lifeless into the dust with the echo of a single shot rolling across the prairie. "You're no camp follower," he said finally, his voice gruff. She shook her line of her jaw was clear enough. "I followed the war, not the men." That chilled the air even more. Following war meant something different out here. It meant showing up at ambush sites, riding along the edges of skirmishes, picking off whoever thought themselves safe at distance. It meant choosing sides, or perhaps choosing none. "Ma'am," said one of the privates, his voice breaking slightly as he spoke. Where'd you fight?" Her gaze flicked to him for the briefest of moments. "Everywhere," she answered. The boy paled. The rifle stock caught the sun again, and once more all eyes fell to the carved marks. The sheer number of them was oppressive, almost unnatural. The air itself seemed heavier around her, as though the rifle carried with it the weight of every life it had taken. Colonel Hawthorne finally swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground. His boots hit the dirt with a thud that seemed louder than it should have been. He took a few steps forward, the men parting instinctively, their eyes darting between their commanding officer and the woman with the rifle. He stopped just shy of her. He wanted to tower over her, but standing on equal ground robbed him of some of that advantage. She wasn't small, and she wasn't afraid. "Why here?" he asked finally, his voice low enough that only the nearest soldiers caught the words. She looked around at the fort, the flag snapping weakly in the hot wind, the half-finished stockade, the restless men. Then her gaze returned to him. "Because you thought this was your range," she said, echoing his earlier words. "Now you know it isn't." Hawthorne's jaw worked. He wasn't used to being turned into the butt of a lesson in front of his men. Discipline relied on respect, and respect bled fast when men smelled weakness. But at the same time, he could feel the tide had already shifted. They were no longer laughing at her. They were watching her the way they'd watch a storm forming on the horizon, with awe and dread. The colonel took a slow step back, lifting his chin as if the movement were his own choice and not forced by the gravity of the moment. "You ride alone?" he asked, trying to claw back a shred of authority. "I ride with this," she said, patting the rifle gently. The murmur that rippled through the men at that answer was almost reverent. Hawthorne turned away, his hand tightening on his gloves. He barked an order at no one in particular, something about drilling, something about discipline. The men scattered sluggishly, not because they feared the colonel's wrath but because they couldn't tear their eyes off the woman much longer without betraying the thoughts running through their heads. As the crowd thinned, the woman shifted the rifle onto her shoulder, her boots crunching softly against the dirt. She didn't need to announce herself further. The notches had already done the talking. By sundown, every man in that fort would whisper her story like a ghost tale by the fire. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Colonel Hawthorne knew one thing with certainty: the frontier had just changed, because he had seen what walked into his camp, not a girl out of place, not a challenge to mock, but a legend in the making.